Socrates, later life and trial. Between 404 BCE, Athens fought one of its bloodiest and most protracted conflicts with neighboring Sparta, the war that we now know as the Peloponnesian War. Aside from the fact that Socrates fought in the conflict, it is important for an account of his life and trial because many of those with whom Socrates spent his time became either sympathetic to the Spartan cause at the very least, or traitors to Athens at worst. This is particularly the case with those from the more aristocratic Athenian families, who tended to favor the rigid and restricted hierarchy of power in Sparta instead of the more widespread democratic distribution of power and free speech to all citizens that obtained in Athens. Plato more than once places in the mouth of his character Socrates' praise for Sparta. Protagoras 342b, Credo 53a, cf. Republic 544c, in which most people think the Spartan constitution is the best. The political regime of the Republic is marked by a small group of ruling elites that preside over the citizens of the ideal city. There are a number of important historical moments throughout the war leading up to Socrates' trial that figure in the perception of him as a traitor. 7 years after the Battle of Amphipolis, the Athenian navy was set to invade the island of Sicily, when a number of statues in the city called Hermes, dedicated to the god Hermes, protector of travelers, were destroyed. Dubbed the Mutilation of the Hermes, 415 BCE, this event engendered not only a fear of those who might seek to undermine the democracy, but those who did not respect the gods. Though Alcibiades was not the only of Socrates' associates implicated in the sacrilegious crimes, Charmides and Critias were suspected as well, he is arguably the most important. Socrates had by many counts been in love with Alcibiades, and Plato depicts him pursuing or speaking of his love for him in many dialogues. Symposium 213 CD, Protagoras 309a, Gorgias 481 days, Alcibiades 103 A104c, 131 E132a. Alcibiades is typically portrayed as a wandering soul, Alcibiades 117 CD, not committed to any one consistent way of life or definition of justice. In 411 BCE, a group of citizens opposed to the Athenian democracy led a coup against the government in hopes of establishing an oligarchy. Though the Democrats put down the coup later that year and recalled Alcibiades to lead the Athenian fleet in the Hellespont, he aided the oligarchs by securing for them an alliance with the Persian satraps. Sparta finally defeated Athens in 404 BCE, just 5 years before Socrates' trial and execution. Instead of a democracy, they installed as rulers a small group of Athenians who were loyal to Spartan interests. Though Critias put forth a law prohibiting Socrates from conducting discussions with young men under the age of 30, Socrates' earlier association with him, as well as his willingness to remain in Athens and endure the rule of the 30 rather than flee, further contributed to the growing suspicion that Socrates was opposed to the democratic ideals of his city. The 30 ruled tyrannically, executing a number of wealthy Athenians as well as confiscating their property, arbitrarily arresting those with democratic sympathies and exiling many others, until they were overthrown in 403 BCE by a group of democratic exiles returning to the city. Both Critias and Charmides were killed, and, after a Spartan-sponsored peace accord, the democracy was restored. The Democrats proclaimed a general amnesty in the city, and thereby prevented politically motivated legal prosecutions aimed at redressing the terrible losses incurred during the reign of the 30. Their hope was to maintain unity during the re-establishment of their democracy. One of Socrates' main accusers, Anytus, was one of the democratic exiles that returned to the city to assist in the overthrow of the 30. Plato's Meno, set in the year 402 BCE, imagines a conversation between Socrates and Anytus, in which the latter argues that any citizen of Athens can teach virtue, an especially democratic view insofar as it assumes knowledge of how to live well, is not the restricted domain of the esoteric elite or privileged few. In the discussion, Socrates argues that if one wants to know about virtue, one should consult an expert on virtue, Meno 91b94e. The political turmoil of the city, rebuilding itself as a democracy after nearly 30 years of destruction and bloodshed, constituted a context in which many citizens were especially fearful of threats to their democracy that came not from the outside, but from within their own city. While many of his fellow citizens found considerable evidence against Socrates, there was also historical evidence in addition to his military service for the case that he was not just a passive, but an active supporter of the democracy. For one thing, just as he had associates that were known oligarchs, he also had associates that were supporters of the democracy, including the Medic family of Cephalus and Socrates' friend Chaerephon, the man who reported that the oracle at Delphi had proclaimed that no man was wiser than Socrates. Additionally, when he was ordered by the 30 to help retrieve the democratic general Leon from the island of Salamis for execution, he refused to do so. His refusal could be understood not as the defiance of a legitimately established government, but rather his allegiance to the ideals of due process that were in effect under the previously instituted democracy.